Hey, this is Dr. C. Glad you could join me again today. We're going to talk about something a little different. Something you don't hear about in the news like a lot of the other things, bad stuff that's in the news. Well, this isn't that great stuff, but you need to know about these things. So I felt that, hey, let's look into it. We're going to talk about hallucinogens. Yes, hallucinogens and magic mushrooms. Woo! Magic mushrooms. Obviously, a lot of us eat mushrooms. Probably most of us do. And those fungi have been around longer than we have. They were here millions of years ago. Millions of years. They help the trees, they help the environment, all sorts of good things. But let's talk about hallucinogens, substances that produce a psychological effect. And that psychological effect may be positive or it may be negative. And you never know. You may take a trip one day, and then a week later, you take a trip, totally different effect. We'll explain a little bit about that as we go along. Now, hallucinogens have been around for a long, long time. And in fact, you hear a lot here on the western part of the world, you might say. We hear a lot about a lot of the tribes that are in Central and South America, the tribes that are coming across that land bridge over Alaska, and all those tribes have used hallucinogens for centuries. And so we will talk a little bit about how they use them. They use them mostly for spiritual things. They communicate with God. Now, of course, their God is not like maybe our Christian God, but they communicate with that spirit, that God. And they do that through their shaman, which is the witch doctor. Now, the witch doctor has a bad, we have that image of a witch doctor looking wild, shaking the rattles and all, putting the needles into the voodoo doll and all. Come on. That's not what a shaman is. A shaman is truly a medical healer. And so the shaman would take some of these hallucinogens, drink it or chew it or do whatever however he prepared it, and use that to go into his trip, basically, and communicate with the gods. We don't necessarily do it that way here. Back in 1970, President Nixon signed my medical release from the military. I have that plaque along with a picture of Watergate right next to it. Good old Tricky Dick. But at any rate, he had signed in 1970 an act that banned all of the psychoactive substances. Banned them all. And that included all of these hallucinogens. We're going to talk about a little bit about that because in probably about 1953, that's when a fellow went down into Mexico and brought back with him some of these so-called mushrooms that were psychoactive. Now, he wrote about it, and it got published in Life magazine, which was a big deal. Life magazine was one of the big ones back in the 1950s. In 1957, they published a big article on magic mushrooms. That's where that term was first, at least the earliest that we know that it was used, magic mushrooms. And so, who read it but Tim Leary? Now, Tim Leary, you may not know this, but he spent a couple of years over at Holy Cross. His father wasn't happy with the way he was going there, and got him transferred over to the military academy, West Point, in New York. Well, he didn't do well, had a lot of demerits. He wasn't the cleanest guy in the world, I guess, so, but he was certainly very intuitive. He was not dumb by any means. So he got his degree actually then in psychology and became eventually a professor of psychology at Harvard. And he had, as I mentioned, in 1957 read this article, traveled himself down to Mexico, brought back some of the mushrooms and all himself. Then he got into lysergic acid, LSD. And from there on, all hell broke loose. He was one of the, he wasn't really a founder of the hippie movement, but he certainly was a big contributor to the whole 1960s hippie movement that occurred. And then after 1970, when Nixon banned all these substances, it was quiet for quite a while until we heard about it again, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, that some of the people, some of the executives actually in Silicon Valley, were using microdosing of magic mushrooms. And so that supposedly gave them a much deeper sense of enlightenment. They were very more intuitive, receptive, very thoughtful. So that started then some probing into some of the positive benefits of these psycho drugs, these hallucinogenic drugs. I'm going to talk first, the first drug we're going to talk about is magic mushrooms. Why not? Why not? Magic mushrooms. They do have hallucinogenic effects, no question about it. And we've studied them. The two major components that cause these hallucinogenic effects are psilocybin, psilocybin, and psilocin. Now, the psilocybin that is in the mushrooms, that's the major thing that's in the mushrooms, the psilocybin. It's not in the spores, it's in the mature mushroom. So that's psilocybin has been studied, and it does work on the serotonin receptors in the brain. Now, the serotonin receptors in the brain are only in certain areas, very small number of actual serotonin receptors in the brain. The major ones have to do with glutamate and other things as well. But that's in specific sections of the brain. Now, we know that it acts on specific serotonin receptors in the brain. What does it cause? What does it do? Okay. There are various dosages of the psilocybin that you can take in. All of the psilocybin gets converted to psilocin in the body anyway, but the psilocybin itself is a lot more stable and it's easier to work with it than psilocin. So, but it all gets converted to psilocin eventually anyway. So these magic mushrooms, and there's over 200 species of magic mushrooms that have psilocybin in them. And they do all work similarly. And they all work on that sensory input, because this is what a lot of the serotonin neuroreceptor or neurotransmitters do. They work on the sensory part of the brain. Now, the sensory part, if you take just a little bit of the magic mushroom, we call that a microdose. Now that microdose can go up to 300 milligrams, but nevertheless, under maybe 500 milligrams is a microdose, of psilocybin. And so you take just a little, you take that first dose, then you get on a little more the second time around, maybe a week later, and you begin to feel a euphoria. And then it begins to work on the sensations in your body. Now, what are the senses? Vision, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting. Those are all senses. And it begins to work on the senses in the body. So at first, it will just distort some of the visual senses. You may not see things clearly anymore. Now it's all wavy. And you may get flashes of different colors. That's part of the euphoria that you may feel from microdosing. Now that euphoria comes on in about 20 to 30 minutes after you take in your initial microdose of the mushroom. Now, it may get a little deeper because, as I said, you take a little more the second time around. You're over that threshold dose. Now, the threshold dose is probably close to about 1 gram of that psilocybin. So you go above that. Now you can have a noticeable effect. It's not just the euphoria now. Now you're going to begin to create things. You're going to change things. You may make illusions up based on the colors and the sounds that you hear. You may hear a certain thing and it's enhanced. It may be something beautiful. But then the next time around, it may not be beautiful. That's the problem with some of these drugs. You have to have the right intention when you go into whatever the trip happens to be. And so, what happens later? You then begin to get, with higher doses, hallucinations. Things that are no longer there, but you think they're there. You see them there. You hear them there. You feel them around you. Hallucinations, things that are not there, but you feel it, you see it, you hear it. You think they're there. So you wind up then with these sensory changes that happen usually around about a minute, about an hour after you take that dose of magic mushroom. And then what happens? Well, then it may morph into more vivid hallucinations. And then after about 3 hours, all of these things begin to fade. All these sensory things begin to fade. Now that is with a typical dose of the magic mushroom. You can also take huge doses. You can take up and over 5 grams. Now, I wouldn't advise that. 5 grams is a lot of psilocybin to take. But if you're used to it, then you may even use those heroic doses, they call them. Once you get on to that magnitude of hallucination, it then begins to work on the receptors, the serotonin receptors that go to the inner part of the brain. You may feel now that you are looking at yourself from the outside. You are no longer part of your body. People have described it as, I thought I was dead and I was looking at myself. That type of a feeling. Now, some people can accept that. Some people can't. And they actually may get into a panic state because, my God, am I dead? Am I alive? What's going on? So these are part of the problems that can occur when you're taking larger doses of the magic mushroom. And there are various ways that you can take them. You can eat the mushroom, right up, pick it up, eat it. You know what a mushroom looks like, for God's sakes. You know the cap that's on the top. There are gills under the cap. And on those gills are little spores, very, very tiny spores. In fact, if you wanted to grow your own magic mushrooms, you would put a little sheet on the bottom or on the ground under the gills and all, and every day come over, tap it a couple of times, knock off some spores. You don't see them, but they're on that pad that you got underneath. And so that's how you can collect the spores from that magic mushroom. Then you have the stem coming down. You have a little skirt at the bottom, a little bulb at the bottom, and then underneath the equivalent of roots. They're called mycelia. Little mycelia that go in, and they get some of the nutrition from the ground and all. But remember those mycelia, the equivalent of that are truffles, and some people actually love truffles, who can afford them, but nevertheless, they're all underground spores. That's all they are. They're fungal spores under the ground that grow in Europe and all. Very expensive things. I've never had a truffle but who knows? Someday maybe I will. So you can eat the mushroom, number one. You can dry them and then eat the dried mushrooms. Eat the dried mushrooms, long as you don't heat the mushroom, because the heat will destroy the psilocybin. So you never, ever want to go over 150 degrees Fahrenheit. You can 130, 140, won't destroy the psilocybin. You can make a tea. You can make the herbal tea out of the psilocybin, as long as you don't go under 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. You can put it into, you can use those spores, put it into sweet things like honey, for example. You can mix it with some chocolate, make some chocolates with the psilocybin. You can put it into little capsules. That's probably the easiest way to take it, is with a capsule, because they can tell you how many milligrams you're taking then. It's a lot easier to determine how much you're using when you take it like that. So most of the capsules contain roughly about 25 or so milligrams of the psilocybin. Okay, so that's how you can take it, many different forms. It works within 20 minutes, like I said, on the serotonin receptors in the brain. Okay, so what else about it? You can grow your own. As I mentioned, you can collect the spores using a little pad underneath, knock off the spores, take the pad out, put that pad into some water, dissolve get those spores out, and put them into, dry it, put them into capsules if you want. So what are some of the the things that you can actually purchase? You can actually purchase spores. Yeah, purchase spores. Most of the spores that you purchase will come from Colorado, because there they at least have, it's not like you can take it for recreational purposes. No state allows you to do that. But they've at least not only decriminalized it there, but they also allowed growing it there as well. The spores don't contain psilocybin, so it's legal for them to transport the spores. So you get them from Colorado, perfectly fine. The most common of all of those 200 magic mushrooms, you might say, is Psilocybe cubensis. Now, the Psilocybe cubensis is the most common one, easy to grow. It grows well indoors, and it has a very good potency of psilocybin. Okay. I get very intrigued at some of the names that they give. For example, even the pot stores, the different species of marijuana that they grow and all, it just blows my mind to see the names that they give it. But they have some fancy names too for some of the species, the strains. of the psilocybe cubensis as well. I'm not going to mention them because some of them are B-rated, but nevertheless. You can also buy other psilocybes besides the cubensis, but that's probably the best one to start with if you want to grow it. Now, if you want to grow it, and now you've got some of the spores, you can actually then, if you wanted to, I guess, you could sell it or give it to your friends or use it yourself. That's fine. Not as easy to grow as, say, marijuana, which is pretty easy to grow. Much easier to grow hemp. So what are the things that you can expect from it? In other words, what are the benefits of magic mushrooms? Well, all of the benefits that you read about come from small studies. They take maybe 30, 40, 50 people, put them on different doses of the psilocybin, people with different problems. Let's say the most common use now is for addictions. It could be drug addiction, tobacco addiction, alcohol addiction, but some addiction. We also use it for PTSD as well. We use it for migraine headaches. We use it for chronic depressive disorders that are not responding to antidepressants. We use it for the chronic anxiety disorders, again, that are not well controlled with anxiety medication. We use it for ADDH. Again, these are all small studies, anecdotal. Certainly, it would never pass the inspection that's done by the CDC. So we know that. But there are problems too, not just benefits. There are problems to using it. Like I said, you never know when you take that drug what it's going to do. Why? Because it's acting on these neurotransmitters in the brain, and the neurotransmitters, like serotonin, like ergot, for example, ergotamine in the brain, all of these things go to certain channels to do certain things with your senses or whatever. Now, new channels can be connected to different parts of the brain that were never connected before. And so we've seen bad panic reactions. We've seen all sorts of different reactions to people taking magic mushrooms when they do their trip. And so usually it's advised, if you're going to take a trip with your magic mushroom, number one, refrain from any alcohol or caffeine before, a good 2 days before. Number two, go into a quiet room. You don't want to have a lot of external noise, a lot of interference with your particular trip. You've got to go into it with the right intention. You've got to keep a blank mind, open mind about it. Number three, bring a sitter with you. In fact, there are courses that you can take to become a sitter for people who are on their hallucinogenic trips, whether it be magic mushrooms, LSD, whatever. You can become a sitter. They call themselves concierges. It's sort of like the designated driver for alcohol. They're not going to be consuming anything. They're going to be watching you, guiding you, keeping you safe. So you got the preparation, the setting, you got your sitter or concierge, and now the last aspect is you need to continue trying to gain use of those benefits after your trip. Now, what do I mean by that? You want to use the trip and not just go on trip after trip after trip and nothing in between. You want to use the benefits of the drug in between any of the trips that you're taking. You want to be able to gain some of the memory, gain some of the insight, gain some of the focus, gain some of the imagination that you can get from the use of these drugs. And you do that in between. And you need to have that ahead of time, and you need to have some guidance in between your trips. And again, that's where that concierge comes in, because they are trained to have you gain all of those benefits in between the trips as well. Now, I mentioned that there are some bad things that can happen. You can get a psychosis. You can really go off the deep end. You can get seizures. You can get seizures from it as well. So people who have had a history of seizures probably should not be using that, using the hallucinogens like that. We have people who don't even remember who they are. You imagine that? They do TV shows about that. Who am I? Somebody got whacked in the head or whatever. Oh, I don't know where I am. Well, that can happen as well. Now, after you've gone on your trip, you can detect the presence of the psilocybin for at least 24 hours after. If you do a hair analysis, it may be positive up to 3 months. Now, you also get very tolerant to the psilocybin, and you need a little more each time you take a trip. But there seems to be no dependence, no physical dependence on it. And so that's briefly it on magic mushrooms. You can buy them around here online, or the best place to go is to the marijuana stores, because they are also into some of this. They know the reputable places where you can get magic mushrooms and buy them legitimately and not worry about it. So that's what I would suggest, is to go to one of the many marijuana stores around here and get your magic mushrooms. Very good. Next show is going to be on all the other hallucinogens that are out there as well. This is Dr. C. Have a nice day.